You're listening to Relatable with Stephanie Michele, only on LA Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Relatable. I am your host, Stephanie Michele, and guess what? You can see me. I'm on the other side of the table today, and I'm pretty thrilled about that. It feels like a lot of freedom, too, because I'm not wired to a headset. So just play in. We're exploring some new things. I get to sit next to my guests. I kind of dig it. You'll tell me, though. You might tell me now you're seeing too much of me. I don't know. I'm in for the feedback. Anyhow, it feels good, though, to be able to look at people right now. So today we're going to talk about feelings, more importantly, like feeling something for something else, like, empathy, really. And maybe the big question is, to feel or not to feel, and what should you care about, or what kinds of feelings should you have to things that are related to you and maybe unrelated to you. So as I was preparing for the show, I started to dive into my own feelings, or addressing kind of where I stand with feelings. And if I'm going to be honest about my human condition, I would say at any given time, I'm pursuing experiences where I want to feel something, or I'm avoiding feeling something. That's honest, right? I've never been accused of not feeling something. I tend to feel things pretty deeply. I often have said that you could blindfold me and put me in a room, and I would be able to tell you what kind of energy and emotion was in that room. And I'm pretty sure that I could still be challenged to do that today, and that would be true. For someone like me that does feel things so deeply, it's not uncommon to develop ways to hide those feelings because you get tired of being labeled emotional or sensitive or a big baby because you cry at even unrealistic scenes in romantic comedies. You can create a stream of tear flow on the most ridiculous moments. It's way too easy for me to put myself in someone else's shoes. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's just who I am. I don't find myself hiding my feelings as much as I used to, but I do find myself wondering where I am in a place between friends and people that I admire that use phrases like zero fucks given, and a pop culture of what I refer to as diet sugar water empathy, where fluffy social media posts like this exist. And I actually pulled this post live today, so this is real. This is not me making it up. The post is, "Don't let anyone dull your sparkle. Hashtag embrace myself, hashtag quotes, hashtag mindfulness, hashtag gratitude, hashtag compassion, hashtag empathy." It's pretty fluffy.
Very fluffy.
Pretty fluffy. So the topic of empathy is definitely something that's important to me, and definitely something that I explore. And I don't want to have my first show of exploring empathy be fluffy, which leads to my guest, because right, I knew that if I brought my guest and my friend to my side here, that we would not be exploring the topic of empathy from a fluffy standpoint. And so before I introduce my guest, I want to share something else that just happened in the moment of me preparing for the show, which is another, you'll actually kind of dig this, but it's just another example of how empathy is a little too fluffy for me right now in the world. I got an email from a brand called Thinks, which is you're gonna love this, Dan, which is a brand of panties that are supposed to be the alternative for a tampon. So they're, you can bleed in them and catch your flow.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. So
efficient.
It's efficient. I haven't had that. I have them, but I haven't had that experience as them being an alternative, and that's all I'm gonna say. And that might be TMI, but I'm just gonna say that. But I got this email from them with a survey that's asking me, to, really give them feedback. And there were so many parts of the survey that I couldn't even relate to. Like, they're like, "What's your favorite part of our blog?" And I'm thinking, I don't relate to your brand. I don't relate to the fluffy ways you tell me how to experience feminism. And there was no category to check that said, I don't relate, or I don't like any of these blog categories. So there's also this empathy and consumerism. There's this movement towards empathy and consumerism where people are telling you, or brands are telling you, how you should feel about something. And I don't know exactly how I feel about this. In this case, I don't relate to it. I don't like to the baby bird approach of feminism. So just they're out there is all I'm saying. There's different ways to experience the fluffiness of empathy, and we're not going to be talking about that too much today. So that does bring me to my guest. This is Dan Fink to my left, and I love being able to say that. I can't even touch you. It's awesome.
I'm real.
You're real. There's a real person. So Dan describes himself as a computer geek, a team member, a student, and a leader. He merges experiences as information technology manager and cognitive psychology research with community psychology and organizational development. He currently serves as a deputy director at the Relational Center. You guys have heard me talk about the Relational Center a lot. I'm one of their biggest fans. I describe him as a great friend, someone that I'm glad that exists in the world, and who has an amazing ability to stay calm, present, and pretty clear about things even when there's a lot of chaos going on around him.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't know who that's describing, but they sound great.
Yeah, you want to meet him?
Yeah.
I'll bring a mirror.
Cool.
I'll pull out a mirror later, and you can talk to him.
Excellent.
So, Dan, we're going to be talking about empathy today.
Yep.
Yeah. And before we do, and I know you've watched the show, and I know you even know why I asked this, but I will still ask it. I always ask guests, like, hey, I have an agenda I know I want to talk about today, but I realize I haven't been with you every second up into the show today, and you might have something that's pulling your energy towards something else that you just want to share, get off your chest, and I would like to give you the opportunity to do that if there's something there.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your show. I know you've been trying for a while, so I'm glad I finally made it in here. It's interesting. So on the way here, I was listening to KPCC, KCRW, one of the public radio stations, and they were talking about how there is slowly becoming a really official move towards evaluating Trump's mental health, which maybe sounds unrelated to this, but it has a lot to do with whether we can judge somebody's mental capacity, their well-being, on their ability to empathize, their ability to think about others. And so the whole time I'm driving and listening to that, I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be the first thing I think about when I sit down next to Stephanie. And what's funny is when I actually sat down, I realized I'm taller than you. So there's a weird juxtaposition of like heavy politics and look, I'm taller.
Well, I mean, and even though you didn't identify with everything I said in the intro, but yeah, having that awareness and clarity about, hey, this is just what I'm experiencing right now is you. So yeah, you're taller than me, Dan.
When we're standing up, it doesn't feel like it.
I've experienced that before. Well, probably because I'm wearing heels a lot of times
cheating.
too. I know. It's not cheating. It's just what ladies like to do.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. All right. Well, good point. We actually had talked about doing a whole show around that, around how much can we learn by somebody in the media's eye about who they really are, but how much of that is real and consistent.
Or is it,
So maybe we'll come back and talk about that.
We might end up there.
We might end up there. But to get us started on this topic, let's just start from the beginning and let's define empathy. Let's put out a good, solid, non-fluffy definition of empathy.
Sure. I'll probably throw out what will sound kind of technical, and then we'll just talk through it. I think really simply, empathy is probably the ability to allow your neurology to experience something somebody else is experiencing. And that sounds really simple, but I think people spend a lot of time getting really confused about empathy versus sympathy versus pity. And nobody teases these apart. They'll say, this is pissing me off, don't you have empathy for me? And the assumption would be that you should feel sorry for them, you should agree, and that's what empathy is, you should be nice to them because they're upset. Like, it's confused all these other experiences. And I think I really like your invitation to not being fluffy. Because oftentimes real empathy is a lot less fluffy.
It's hard.
It's hard. And if you're only empathizing with people whose perspective you agree with, you're not really doing much empathy. You know what I mean? You might be relating to somebody, you might feel like you're on their side, but to really, it's like going to the gym and not putting any weights on the machine, right? You claim you're working out, but you might not be really stretching any muscles. Whereas to try harder to imagine what it's like to be in someone's experience, to really think about where they come from, how they see the world, how the world has regarded them, family, culture, work experience, friends, et cetera, where you would see the world differently than you see it if you sat in their shoes.
Yeah.
That's real empathy.
That's empathy.
Yeah.
So what's coming up for me when you say that is empathy requires some sort of extension out of your comfort zone in many cases. Like, it's not just like, well, I can understand where you're coming from because we're a lot alike, or we share the same values, we have the same beliefs.
Totally.
It's really going a little bit into a discomfort to go, okay, I can understand how you feel. Now, it doesn't mean that empathy makes you agree with the action or the person or the thoughts.
Right.
It's just like, I can understand where you're coming from.
Right.
Right?
Right. Well, and our individualist capitalist culture tells us not to give up that turf, right? Like, if you're in a debate with somebody and you want to convince them to see it your way, you don't say, I can see it your way.
Yeah.
Right? It's just, we're just taught not to say that, unless maybe it's to a romantic partner or to your child, or like, so in that way we kind of set up this artificial boundary that empathy only belongs in those touchy-feely moments.
Right.
It's not about bridging political views or ideologies or religion or, much bigger issues.
Right. I joked with Dan earlier this week when we were preparing for the show that debating is not relating. And debating is not empathy. Like, somebody wins, somebody loses, but there's not a chance that we're moving towards, like, we're going to understand, which I believe there's better solutions to be had when you're moving towards that. And yes, of course you want that in a relationship because you want to stay in it. You want to resolve what's going on. But yes, like in a debate, we don't see that. And I've often said, especially after the last political cycle and the debates,
the world we're now in.
Yeah, the world that we're now in. I don't find the debates helpful. What I would love to see is that they put the candidates in a room together, they give them a problem, and they say, you're not coming out of this until you find a solution together. And I'd want to watch that like a voyeur. I'd want to watch every minute of that because I want to see how, I want to see the power of persuasion. I want to see how they work together. I want to see how they extend to understand each other. Like, that would...
It sounds great.
Yeah.
I think there's a danger, though, because even politicians that aren't aware of it have learned to use empathy against us. They've learned to tell a story that suggests they know the best well-being for people. And almost any issue you could trap them in a room working on, they're not actually working on the issue, they're working on...
their political agenda.
Their idea of what would solve that issue.
Yeah.
If you actually got to follow around politicians day to day doing their job, that would be way more fun.
Yeah.
Right? Like, show us a week in the life of what
Give them a body cam.
Of what you do, with a body cam, and then let us judge if you're going to work well for us or not.
I can understand what you're saying about that. I mean, I feel the same way about brands and, for-profit businesses. Like, they're like I mentioned in my monologue, it's like they're aligning themselves with something and telling you how to feel about it, but it's really comes back to, well, because if you feel the way that I feel, you'll buy our products.
Yeah. That's a whole...
I know.
That's a whole tangent. So it's interesting when you think about economics, and you take like an economics 101 class, and the first thing they talk about is this idea of a savvy consumer.
Yeah.
Right? That businesses should be able to be as aggressive as they want, because as consumers, we're making smart decisions. We're going to evaluate what's best for us. But then we're 40, 50, 60 years in to those organizations hiring psychologists to exploit our empathy and to show us an image of what they think, given our race, our gender, our age, our whatever, are going to like, knowing
respond to,
knowing full well we're not actually making savvy consumer choices. We're going with what we've sort of grown to feel is familiar, is interesting, is stylish, is delicious. I mean, think about how many restaurant chains are hugely popular, but we all know the food's not good.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's so much conditioning in there, like fashion. There's so many industries that work that way.
Sex, those stupid Carly hamburger commercials. I hate that brand.
Totally.
It's just really
exactly
that makes me want to buy a hamburger.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
they're not aimed towards me, obviously, as a woman, but
and the I think sometimes scary flip side of that is, especially amongst really activist liberals who are trying to combat that way of thinking, is they're fighting for some really honest, really genuine solution to that, where these companies are going to come forward and say, "Oh, sorry, I've been manipulating you." Right? We don't want to get rich.
Yeah.
Right.
Of course.
You know,
That's not it.
Or asking politicians or government officials to be like really honest and like it's
not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. It's not. It's you know, it's a failure to empathize with their position. Right? If the survival of your job is maintain this backing, maintain this support, maintain this endorsement, why would you do things?
Yeah.
That would cut that off.
Differently.
So yeah.
Well, here's a big question on empathy.
Sure.
I mean, why do the levels of empathy in the world matter? Why should we care about this? I mean,
it's a good question. I think there are some people that would say we shouldn't and that it's not important. I mean, I think there's a turning point socially that's probably been obvious to a lot of other countries for a long time, but now we're having to wrestle with, which is what guides the progress of a society. And I think since the Industrial Revolution at least, it's been guided by amassing wealth, power, success, and those aren't always necessarily bad. But when institutions are designed to exploit the very protections that we thought we were creating in government and social structures to further their success at the expense of the majority of the humans trying to live, it brings up a pretty ethical question, right? Are we going to fight for a society that's guided by values, you know, values that are about each other's well-being, and there isn't money or fame to fight over? Or are we going to embrace a very false narrative about like power dominates and strongest survives, which once upon a time might have been very true, and now it's kind of a myth that people fall back on to validate their actions, right?
Yeah.
To validate buyouts, to validate layoffs, to validate, you know, all these things you have to do to please shareholders because you have people who've invested in your company. And you know, I think what's really interesting about that, I worked with a social entrepreneur consultant a few years back, and he was looking at all of the investment firms that had made a commitment to human impact. They hadn't started investing in like nonprofits and only social change. They were really just doing business as usual, but they would only invest in organizations that had a human impact, what they call like a social responsibility clause, have some sort of internal mandate to do good by their employees, relationships, community. Across the board, 5% better returns for those companies. And that was a decade ago. And now you look at the Googles, you look at the .coms, they have campuses with 5 restaurants and games and parties. Like, their job positions require 30% of their time to be like fun and creativity. And yet none of this has creeped into our day-to-day culture enough.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, and it brings me to the next question I want to ask. But you know, I run a marketing firm, and I specialize in customer retention, and it's been my way of saying, look, I can only work with businesses that actually care about being in a long-term relationship with their customers, and like, what does that look like, and like, how do we know that we're servicing them from more than a wants standpoint, but like what they really need, and you know, and getting the feedback, and then also like doing that internally and like keeping the people happy. And so and that is also profitable and trackable on a spreadsheet. Now, I will tell you this, that it takes longer to get there, and that's why I think most companies won't, you know, just pursue being more empathetic or caring about their work culture or caring who they're connecting with.
Scared of the bottom line.
Yeah, they want fast profits, and sometimes they have to. Like, I have a lot of conversations with Uber drivers because I Uber quite a bit. I Uber to and from the show every day, and they're complaining. They think it's pretty unfair. You know, their bonus system changes all the time. Like, they don't feel like, you know, that they kind of get told one thing that they're going to make a bunch of money, and then it's not the case. And I had to explain to them, it's like, well, here's the deal. Uber went in and got a lot of money from investment, investment money, and they have to pay that back somehow, you know. So they're not looking to make you happy. They're looking to like give the least amount of money out and make the most money right now because they owe it to their investors. Like that is just what it is, you know, the honest to God truth. Like, they can say that they want to be nicer to you, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, it's I don't know, it brings up two things. Like, one is like, remember with the financial crash about 10 years ago, this notion of too big to fail, which trickles into this because if we don't have the expectation that some businesses will fail and that that's okay, and that if we're not holding them to a standard that does well by the society they serve, you can make money, be successful, and we pretend that their success is more important than the well-being of the people, then you end up with that weird scenario. The other thing that it reminds me of is, you know, there was this idea, I remember as a kid, of voting with your dollars, right? That was the big political thing in the 90s, is you vote your support for different issues by who you spend your money on. And that's kind of faded away a little bit. There's a lot of really actually successful buy local movements and things like that. But I think as it relates to empathy, there's an interesting phenomena of people being terrified to embrace the complexity that they have to hold if you actually start empathizing with the CEO, the customers, the people exploited to make the product, right? Like there's all these things to empathize with, and if you try to hold that complexity, you'll probably feel overwhelmed and just decide these problems are unsolvable. I'm going to wait until the government and the CEOs fix it for me. And I can't afford to fix this, so I'm just going to go buy what's cheapest and easiest and not embrace it. And I think, you know, if I tell anybody any advice when they hit that dilemma, be part of the problem and the solution at the same time.
Totally.
Don't delude yourself that you're going to only drink organic kombucha and use hemp cloth backpack. Like, just live your life. But whenever there is a small choice you can make, like using Lyft instead of Uber,
he gets on me about that.
There are just little subtle things, and you can't do all of them. But if you do none of them, you're essentially saying, screw it. Just exploit me until we're all dead, except for a certain
right. You know. There's a couple things that are coming up, not just from a company standpoint, and I want to get off this, actually. I want to talk more about empathy in our relationships and things. But and so moving off that, you know, there is complexity in caring. Sorry, there is complexity in caring, and stepping out of your comfort zone to relate to something that you don't know. You know. It becomes a lot easier with travel, by the way. It's like the best way to to develop your empathy muscles is to travel and experience other cultures. So I'm a big advocate of that. But even as a person that's promoting it and doing the work in the space, which we both do, and you know, you've been really instrumental in teaching me that you have to have support. Like if you're going to be caring and putting yourself out there to kind of, you know, drive that truck, drive the empathy bus, like you have to have some support behind you. On my last show, the Sidewalk Talks, they talked about empathy circles, where their groups of volunteers like get in groups and little niche cultures together to support, to continue to do the work, and like that's what it takes. That's what it takes.
Yeah, I mean it's the ultimate conundrum of individualism, right? We've adopted a social norm about like be a self-made person, and evolutionarily, it's never been the human story. Ever. It's something we invented, I don't know, 100 years ago. It's brand new in the story of us as humans, and it just doesn't work that way.
I agree.
The human, like maybe millions of years from now, but at the moment, the human brain and how we are socialized and learn and grow, just not capable of holding the level of complexity it takes to do all the things we need to do to live well together, which is, you know, why there's division of labor, which is why in a family you share responsibility, which is like it's
Well, let's try to go more into the benefits. And not fluffy, but let's talk about the benefits of really being an empathizer or practicing empathy. So, are there science? Is there some science behind the benefits of empathy, or even some well-being things that we can talk about?
There's a bunch. I mean, you know, if you look at any of the really cutting-edge design industries, they use like cross-discipline teams. They foster situations where you're going to be faced with a different perspective on purpose, because it'll heighten creativity. It'll lead to a product that's more resilient and sustainable, whether it's, you know, just a visual design or a new design of underwear, right? Like there's all sorts of
You're glad you learned about that today, aren't you?
Yeah, going to keep that in my pocket.
Literally in your pocket.
a good bar conversation at some point, I'm certain.
Don't ask a woman if she's wearing them, by the way.
Noted.
Noted. Like, hey, you heard these things? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So there's definitely even profit-driven things that are benefits. In terms of health, I think, being like a former computer geek and corporate whatever, and now in the mental health world, there's a lot of really interesting things that I didn't actually think I was going to learn in the mental health world about empathy. So just to think of a couple like examples, one will be obvious, the other will be scary.
Okay.
The obvious one is relationships, right? When you think about like what a couple comes to couples counseling for, the vast majority of the time, they're entrenched on two different sides of issues where the only solution that's visible is being right. Or having their perspective seen and the others abandoned. And this doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? Each of them have gone to their friends and family and said what's happening, and their friends and family couldn't handle the complexity. So they're like, oh, you're right, they are a bad person.
And they're paraphrasing, and you're telling sort of the version that you want your friends to believe in. And
exactly, you're presenting it from your experience, which isn't bad, it's just you piece all these things out into individual experiences rather than shared experiences. And it's too easy to fall into like being a real cheerleader for one side of the issue and not the other. And then those two get to therapy and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, therapist. I've got 5 years of data, 5 years of research with my friends and family that proves, they're wrong. They need to apologize and change their behavior. And I think one of the very first things that like a decent therapist will do is confront that, often not politely, and just say, if you're more invested in being right, you don't want this relationship. Just call that bluff as quickly as possible. I mean, compassionately, but obviously there's going to be some history and some wounds and some injury and some struggle that makes it
and I'm sure you have to be really careful in terms of when you say that, like when you think that
for sure.
both parties could kind of hear that. For
sure, but it's, like I have an ethical attitude about therapy that it's exploitive to charge that much money. Like if you think about 4 sessions a week, $100, $200 an hour, that's rent, or at least half of rent for a lot of people in LA. What are you going to take that from people for years before you point out the dilemmas in their assumptions? And well, they're not their own, it's like social assumptions, but and it's really hard work. You said earlier, debating's not relating. Another expression that you could throw out as often as you like is empathy is not endorsement.
I love that. Empathy is not endorsement.
It doesn't mean you agree.
Because I can understand. And doesn't mean that I support what you're doing or can't.
Exactly. It just means like I'm human also. I understand you're having an experience that when I really imagine it, I understand. Doesn't mean I agree. Doesn't mean I like it.
And I wish I had a pen. I'm going to write that down.
I won't forget that one.
You won't forget that. I'm sure you won't. And these are the things that we need to be in practice around relating to remember. Like, I think that I talk about fast food relating. We're not really relating when we're texting and we're relating through social media. And it's like, you've got to slow down and have a moment to go, there's distinctions in every single thing that I can say to you in language. And, I know that, like recently I had to tell somebody I was uncomfortable by their communication and they haven't responded to that yet.
Hard to do.
And I know that this person could go, well, she doesn't like me anymore, or she's mad at me. I'm like, no, it couldn't be further from the truth. I'm just uncomfortable with our communication around this particular project. Doesn't mean I don't like you, and it doesn't mean I'm mad at you. So
we're so terrified of being seen as the villain from somebody else because we have this weird, like, modern version of tribalism where if we can maintain sort of a homogeneity of how we behave, it might not be by race or gender, often it is, but it might not be. It might just be about how do we keep things status quo? How do we keep things easy? And when that gets upset, you must be a bad person. There must be something wrong with you for wanting to like upset that boat. And it's funny, another expression that's more nerdy, so don't worry about trying to memorize it, but I often say, try out wearing the attribution. So if somebody is claiming that you had this impact you didn't intend, right? You might have been meaning to do X, Y, or Z, but you really hurt me, right? Our instinct these days is to be like, well, that's not what I intended, so you should get over it. Right? And it often doesn't matter what we intend. you know. So to wear that attribution would be to say, like, let go for a moment that being that person for that other person at that moment is not as important as just saying, yeah, I did hurt you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not having to say, oh, but I didn't intend it. Oh, but I didn't.
But, or any kind of but.
Right.
Yeah,
and it's scary,
yeah.
but you do that 3 times and you see somebody's experience validated, and 2 minutes later, that other person's like, oh, thank you. You know,
Yeah.
I know you didn't mean it. Like, there's some validation and healing where if you can't step into that sort of empathetic stance, you devalidate someone's experience. It makes people feel crazy. And it's a human instinct that when their perspective is feeling oppressed or marginalized, to fight back.
Yeah.
So if you don't validate it, and I don't mean validate in a cheesy, like,
Yeah.
you know, validate every feeling. I'm not thinking fluffy. I mean just respect it. You're essentially implicitly telling somebody fight back.
Yeah. I'm often the one implementing those experiences, and I'm sure you're like, well, I'm sure you're shocked to hear that. And, you know, for me, why I do it is not because I like drama or I'm trying to create conflict. It's not. I don't like it. But I really, truly believe, and because I've experienced the other side of it, is like, I know if we go through this together,
Right.
we'll both feel better afterwards. It might be a slight little ping or a little sting, but I know we'll both feel better about it afterwards.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's why I do it. And I liked my guest last week. She also said, you know, don't go into therapy or go into a situation with the motivation of like, well, I'm doing this because I want to be a better person.
Right.
Like, go into it go with the motivation of I want to feel better. Like, what I'm doing is not working for me, and I'd like to feel better.
Yeah.
And like that, to get to that point does
Right.
require a little discomfort.
Totally. And I could twist that invitation a little bit and say, go into it with the desire to be a wiser person.
Mm-hmm.
Go into it with the desire to be someone who understands things more complexly.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't actually mean you necessarily will feel better.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, there's a bunch of great videos about empathy. Roman Krasnazarek, I don't know how to pronounce his name, is amazing with what he says about empathy. And
We'll share that. I'll share that in the resources.
One of the things he suggests is to stop trying to learn about who you are and what defines you by sort of sitting and reflecting on your own experience,
Yeah.
but instead go explore the experiences of others, and that it's in that overcoming of otherness and in that sort of adventure
Yeah.
that you actually learn what's really important to you. And that's kind of what you're saying about travel. Right?
Yeah.
The more you experience other cultures, other people's perspectives, other foods, other whatever, the more the things you take for granted about your experience
Mhm.
are no longer invisible.
You know your
Yeah.
values and beliefs, and it actually turns that switch of curiosity on too. Because
Yeah.
like the more you know that, like, oh, there's things outside of my bubble, and they're
Yeah.
like really cool, and like I have more questions about that, and they're exciting. Like the more that gets turned on,
Definitely.
and there's a lot of joy and curiosity. Like it's like
Right.
that 3-year-old kid, you know, asking why is the sky blue? You know,
Yeah.
like it's good.
It is good.
It feels good.
I'd promised a scary example.
Okay,
also.
yeah, scary example.
So the other thing that I discovered in mental health work is there are a lot of scenarios where therapists are terrified to empathize, to validate, or to agree with. They're scared they're agreeing with someone's actions or perspective. So let's use self-harm, right? So let's say you're working with somebody who's been cutting for years. The first thing that I think everybody should know or hear me say is that doesn't mean they're suicidal. People think that, right? You think if someone's self-harming, oh, that must be like baby steps towards suicide. It's generally not. But the therapists are often terrified to say, what's beneficial about that? How does that help you cope? How does that support your emotional experience? Because they think they'll be endorsing it. Right, by asking the questions that would help them empathize,
Right.
that would help them be in the shoes of someone where self-injury is actually a support, is so scary because they want to endorse it. So if we're going to be radically empathetic therapists, I even know of a therapist who has invited their clients to bring their knives into the session
Wow.
and hold it together and talk about like how valuable is this thing, you know. And then the flip side of that is once you can sit in their experience, you have so much respect for their dignity as a person. You're then going to care about, like, are you cleaning the wound? right? Are you cutting in places where it's not going to cut a major artery, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole, but it's an example of how when you actually implement empathy in a profession, it's not fluffy or easy.
Yeah.
It's really scary, but it's...
What's coming up for me in that is that exploration, you're getting to the why, and then you're knowing the values and beliefs behind the person, which is often where the problem exists, because you can have values and beliefs that are serving you, and some that are not, and that's where maybe the trauma is, right? I'm not a therapist. You got to correct me if I'm wrong
you're
here.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I can see value in that. I can understand how that's really scary, and I don't know if I would be able to implement something like that, but I get it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about how many relationships we've had where trying to constantly tell people what to do actually works.
Yeah.
Not many.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you think that works, you're probably exhausted all the time.
Yeah. Nobody likes unsolicited advice.
From trying to do that. So there's a different thing plays out when you respect their perspective and experience as legitimate.
Yeah.
You might not agree. It might terrify you. But something more collaborative and sustainable will emerge.
And there's even healing in that, like just being seen in a moment. It's so great that I'm doing this show back to back from the one I did earlier, because we were just talking about, like, they just, Sidewalk Talk, they have this simple nonprofit where they just set up chairs in a park and invite people to sit down and be listened to, and the idea of sitting across from someone, and they square off, it's like eye contact would be like us looking like this, those moments of just being okay, you're fully okay with whatever is going on right now, and someone kind of telling you that, or by just listening. Like, I'm not here to give you advice or tell you what to do or show you that I'm smarter than you or bigger than you. I'm just experiencing you right now, and you right now is full and complete and cool and fine.
Yeah, I would say that's, socially needed. It's amazing that they're doing that. And it's one of the core building blocks, I think, to some really radical social change that's going to get us out of a lot of the messes we're in.
Yeah.
Because if you can build the muscles for that, you can then add on to it how to have a good fight.
Yeah.
How to disagree well.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? How to empathize, but also say, like, I can feel what it's like to be in your shoes, and I hate you. And I don't ever want you to do the things that this perspective motivates you to do. Right? To hold those two together is really difficult, and I think it's two skills we have to build together.
Yeah, I agree. We're getting close to being further along in the show and almost to the end, so I'm going to ask, let's see, I think an important question to really cover on this topic, and like I said, I'm sure I'm going to be doing more shows on empathy, so this is just maybe like part one on it.
Right.
But if you were to advise someone how to empathize in a particular role, what would that look like? And let's be like friend and intimate relationships, maybe leader. What other one would be good to cover?
A lot of them.
Leader, parent, friend, and lover, kind of.
The short version of the advice is pretty much the same for a lot of them. It's going to sound sort of hippy-dippy Buddhist, but put your ego aside. Doesn't mean you can't become an authoritarian enforcer right after. It doesn't mean you can't disagree and make an oppressive policy as a leader. It doesn't mean you can't ground your child as a parent. It doesn't mean you can't be mad at your partner later. But if you can set ego aside for just a few minutes and start with, like, how did you come to that conclusion? Tell me more about what got you there. And I think something critical in that suggestion is, don't ask how you feel. Don't be like, how do you feel about that? Right? Like, the second you make it fluffy, you invite an experience that's disconnected from context. You invite an experience that you kind of have no choice but to be like, oh, okay, so you're sad. I can't disagree with sad, right? But if you get curious not just about the feeling, but about what context got you there, right? What perspective, what experiences, what makes that a reasonable choice or a way to see things or do things, you're going to learn something, and then you can always go back to, like, well, I don't care. I just disagree with you, and I'm leaving, right?
And maybe,
but it's buying that few milliseconds of neural time that stretches our patience for having an attention span for more than just the one word we want to hear to know we're safe, we're loved, we're cared for, we're going to be okay.
So kind of slow down, try to listen, ask maybe a question,
asking questions,
take a break. I like the idea of like, you know, if we get triggered, we're humans, we get triggered, and it's usually something that has nothing to do with the person standing in front of you. So it might require you to go, you know what, I can't really do this right now. Like, it's so important, and I know something else is at play. I don't know what it is. Can I just pause? You know, can I back out of this for a minute?
My co-leaders at TRC and I have a pretty open agreement with each other that when we get emails from each other we don't respond. We ignore it for a day and then come back to it and either talk about it or completely ignore it rather than respond from reactivity.
Oh, now I understand why you don't answer all my emails very quickly. That was just revealed. Can we just have a code name for it, like Caterpillar? Like, this is a Caterpillar email. Like,
I've got a good friend whose safe word is pineapple.
Pineapple. I like it.
Anytime something's too uncomfortable or it's going out of their safe zone, pineapple.
Pineapple. I like it. I like it. All right. Last question on empathy before we switch gears for the show. Is there anything you, Dan, personally, would like to see more empathy for in terms of like a world issue or a topic or a theme?
Boy.
Is there a list?
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many answers.
Yeah.
I think the place to start is always people's immediate relationships. And, you know, for various different reasons, we have these fantasies that we're going to figure out how we want to be in the world first. Whether it's for a relationship or a job or whatever, we're going to figure that out first, and then we're going to go be that person. And we're not going to have conflict, and we're not going to be sad about anything, and we're not going to be angry at work because we've done our work or whatever. And I would just say, get over that. Find the few close friends or family that you can be messy with, and go figure it out together. And be scared of their opinion, and be reactive for a minute, and then take a breath and walk away, and come back and be like, that pissed me off, but I want to understand it. Let's talk. Like, start small with the few people you can build those skills with, and then
I would 100% agree. I mean, I could list topics and concerns that I have that are more on a worldly or even, you know, on our nation level, but I really believe, this is why I'm doing the show, is that it has, if we can empower and get it started first personally and practicing, then we have a chance to apply it to these other issues. So 100% in agreement with you.
Definitely.
All right, so that was a big topic. It's empathy. We'll probably talk about it again. Because the show is about relating, I like to show different examples of how we can relate. And I always say there's really two things in terms of relating that I focus on. One, at any given time, how we're relating can change. You can get a phone call, you're distracted, your mind's somewhere else, that kind of thing. And there's always more information available. So we've heard about Dan and how he feels about empathy in this particular topic, but by no means do you know Dan. By no means do you even know me at this point. You know, you haven't heard everything that's here. So just to go a little fluffy, to go a little light, I like to ask off-topic fun questions, and I don't prepare them. It's just this little box. I have no idea where it's going. You can refuse to answer, you know, but but that wouldn't be fun. All right, so the question is, what's the most embarrassing moment you've witnessed? I like that it's you witnessed and not that you've done.
Embarrassing moment you've witnessed.
That's a safe question.
What's the most embarrassing moment I've witnessed? That's a good one.
I can think of, I mean, I'm embarrassed for a couple people that we see almost every day on the TV, like some of the things that they're saying. But
but they're getting paid to, or at least I assume they're getting paid to degrade themselves.
Do you want to say experienced? And go.
Sure, I could go experience.
You could go experience? Let's go real vulnerable.
That's what's funny is that's what came to mind first. And I was like, wait a minute, but that was me experiencing it.
Now you're looking in on that experience.
Yeah, it's a vulnerable one. So many years ago, I had a girlfriend who we lived in separate cities. Not at first, but at some point living in the same city in LA didn't work, and they moved. And I would travel up north where they lived to visit on a regular basis, and I thought they wanted to be closer to their family. They were, sorting some things out. it became pretty obvious at one point. I was at a party with 20 or 30 of my friends from that part of the world, and it became very obvious that she had been sleeping with at least one of them, maybe more.
Oh, boy.
And everybody in the entire house knew.
Yeah.
So 20, 30 people that were all friends of mine, friends of theirs, knew.
Yeah.
And no one had called me, told me.
Well, that is her embarrassing moments. Like, that is something that you witnessed. Like,
I don't think at the time
yeah.
she recognized it as that, but yeah.
That's not right. I'm sorry, Dan. Now I'm glad I'm sitting next to people I can go, oh.
It was definitely a demoralizing moment.
It's not good. Now, because that was such a deep share, and it should, and you know, let's get some, well, I'm going to give you a choice.
Okay.
I'll either pull another question and ask you, or you can pull a question and ask me.
Oh.
Oh.
I'll pull a question and ask you.
Okay, go for it.
All right.
You're like, it's not.
What book do you wish you'd written?
You know what? I've answered this question on the show before. I really like. No, I can't even think of the name of the book. Love Warrior by Glenda Dell Melton. It's a memoir, and I just like how raw and real and like messy her book was. It's helpful, it's healing, but it's helpful and healing because it's so beautiful how she's communicating, because it's like, I've thought that before. Man, I wish I was brave enough to say that. I really like that book. And then I would say, if I had another one that comes to mind almost level to that, is Harville Hendricks' book, that it just, because it was a turning point for me. I don't know, you like, therapists have different opinions about different therapists' work, but I really like that book. I like that it also dives in, and the book is getting the love that you want, and it makes you sort of do the work. It's a good place to start.
It is. I was just going to say, I smirk at it, but it is a great place to start.
Yeah. It's a good place to start. Okay. Sure. So we have a couple more minutes, and so the last thing that we do on the show, Dan, is what I call a heart swell moment. And what I mean by that is I just ask the guests if to think about like somebody that's been really meaningful in their life, that's made a difference, that you want to say something to, like a tribute, a new commitment, and just a shout out. And the reason that I ask guests to do this is I feel that we're a little scared, and we've kind of talked about it today. We're kind of a little scared around like admitting deep feelings and talking about it, and we don't do it enough. And so I just want to show an example of it not being so scary. And hopefully, by doing this over and over again, that we are raising the level of empathy in the world by expressing deep feelings. Right. So are you willing to share a heart swell moment, first of all?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Do you have something in mind?
I do.
Okay, good. So I don't have to fill the space with joke telling or whatnot. And you can look right at you.
Well, I could look to camera, but I want to look at you when I tell you this.
Okay. Uh-oh.
It's funny because I've seen your show, and I knew this was coming. And I don't know if you recall talking the other night. I said, gotta write something down. This is what I realized.
Oh, yeah. It was like the awkward pause on the phone call. I'm like, what is he doing?
Because something about this became really obvious to me in that conversation. So my heart swell is for you, because there are so many people avoiding stepping forward as you do, and doing the public shared experiences, doing this show, and it's messy often.
Yeah, it's totally messy.
And I'm actually like, so I don't know if any of your listeners will care about this level of detail, but we actually met years ago, and I'll be honest, me and the folks you met at the Relational Center back then were a mess. And so it's sort of a miracle that years later you're like, I still want to be friends, I still want to do stuff. So it's just really miraculous to me that you are making a brand out of this, are making it a thing you champion, even when it's messy, and even when it doesn't necessarily work, you have no qualms about trudging forward. Because it's kind of like my biggest terror is being like a public figure and a voice people are listening to and critiquing. So that's my heart swell, is my admiration for you.
Thank you. Like, it's kind of, if that's so, I could tear up. That's really meaningful to hear. And I want to say two things. One, when something is said to you that's so amazing and you don't know really what to say, it is say thank you, because it's a gift. And it's this thing that I talk about grace. It's like, maybe I needed to hear this right now, because he knows it's been a little messy lately. And, it's messy because I'm committed to it being messy in a way that I want people to see that it's not, I don't really know much more than anybody else. I'm like just as susceptible to relating woes as anybody else is. The only difference might be for me is like there's this major curiosity switch that's on, and that I feel if I can put myself into experiences where I'm really vulnerable, then I can share that and it's going to help somebody else. So I do it, and it's not always, it's messy. It's not always great, but that's what I want. I'm committed to that because there's plenty of people that are doing great work, that are therapists that have wrote books, and it's really clean, and all of their social media posts look great, and they're like, it's very curated. There's plenty of that out there. I'm not going to do that. Like, I don't want to.
Well, they're doing it the safe way.
Yeah.
They're doing it with the buffer of anonymized media and not in-person relating. And, there's a funny saying that we say, because we train all of our therapists, volunteers, community organizers in empathy and diversity and interdependence and a whole bunch of things, and we say, don't try this at home. We send them off with a warning, because we know when you step out of a community that shares your curiosity, that shares an interest in diving into these things, it's very isolating. Yeah. People get defensive and reactive and don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, I mean...
And you continue to do it even in the face of that.
I've definitely, and I know you could relate to this too, I've had people ask, well, if you're feeling so much pain, why do you continue to carry about this? Like, why are you doing this work? We don't get it. Like, why? And I'm like, it would be denying myself. Yeah. It would be, it's...
Well, like you said, the flip switch is a good metaphor. Like, once it's flipped, even if it's painful, you can't stop seeing and feeling what you now see and feel. It's on. You hit an awareness point where you can't turn back.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. You'll be back. We have so many other topics that we can talk about, if not a part 2 and a part 3 of empathy and all kinds of things. So I know that you'll be back. We'll have some other topics.
Would love
to be had here. And of course, as Dan has said, we share the Relational Center, passion for the Relational Center. He's there all the time. This is where I do the public shared experience events. The next one is
everybody should come to. They're lots of fun. They
are fun. It's weird. People sign up and people don't show up because I think there's some fear around it, but we actually do have fun. The whole point is like to have an experience where relating feels good, and that's what I'm committed to. There might be tears, there might be a little bit of like something to get there, but at the end everybody leaves lifted and feeling good.
Well, and I can assure everybody as a therapist that there are so many people in this world that come to therapy and their story is, I'm lonely, I'm isolated, I need my feelings, and then they sit at home and watch Netflix.
Yeah.
Because there is this fear that it's going to be overwhelming. It's going to be too much. People are going to keep asking me how I feel. I'm going to cry. And luckily, you're not a therapist, so public shared experience is a lot more accessible.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to step into. It's just fun relating.
Yeah, it is fun relating. It's kind of sometimes silly, but it's fun. Yeah. So the next one, we're trying something new. We're going to go on a Wednesday night at 7 p.m. It's Wednesday, May 24th. That's the next one coming up. Love to see you there. You can find out all the information about the event, the Relational Center, details of the event, and there's other ones scheduled for June on my site, stephaniemichele.com. Also, check out the site the day after the show. I've been putting the archives of what we talked about there, which includes the backstories. I can tell you more about the backstory between Dan and I. Any resources that we talked about, the videos, they'll be there.
So many great TED Talks and things. It's
on
amazing.
empathy. We'll definitely be sharing those. And as always, reach out to me. I'm on Twitter at LoveMoreNow and Instagram at RelateWithSteph. I'm still, Dan, we might have to talk about this offline. I'm still looking for a closing tagline. I used to say happy relating, but we have, as we've talked about that, it's too fluffy. It's not always happy. And then I was like, relate with intention. And now I'm just relate with more curiosity.
Watch some of the Roman Krasnazaric. I'm so sorry that I butcher his name because he's amazing. And there's something in there about like starting a revolution.
Yeah.
Maybe you can figure out.
Maybe
some
I'll find it in
that's,
there.
like starting the relating revolution or
All
something.
right. I will continue to do my homework on this. I'm a work in progress always, so I'm sure something will come up. And then lastly, next week, you join me. My guest will be John Weiland, who does work around intimacy, couples intimacy, and just, healing around intimacy. And so he's also a friend that I haven't seen in a while that I connected with at Burning Man. And it will be interesting to kind of reconnect on camera and talk about that. So thanks, Dan.
Thank you
for joining me, and we will see you guys next week.
You're listening to Relatable with Stephanie Michele, only on LA Talk Radio.